She had a secret she'd guarded like a wound, a secret she thought would make her small, make her easy to take. She fled beneath a moon that had watched kings and monsters rise and fall. She hid in a cabin no map remembered. She told herself the forest would hold her, that the darkness would be her ally. But a single knock at midnight would prove that running from destiny never closes the door on it. It only changes the way fate finds you. Arya ran like the world had already broken. Snow bit her ankles. The hem of her cloak flapped like a wounded bird. Pines leaned over the path like accusing sentries. She could hear the rhythm of the village drums fade behind her, a heartbeat she'd once kept time to as a child. Tonight they beat for a different reason, the claiming. Every 10 years the claiming called together those born under the moon. The Alpha King, crowned by blood and ceremony, would step forward and choose his mate, or so the elders insisted. For some, the claiming was a promise, for others, a verdict. Arya had never been convinced of promises spoken by men in capes. She had one memory of her mother, kneeling by the hearth, hands trembling as she tied a faded ribbon into Arya's hair. "Run if your heart fears," her mother had whispered, voice soft as ash. "Find a road the wolves don't know." Arya had thought that line poetic once. Now it was a plan. Branches clawed at her face. Her breath rose in white clouds. The moon spilled silver across the snow, making the forest look like an ocean frozen midstorm. She shoved deeper, pressed into places the patrols never bothered. She wanted to reach somewhere that had been abandoned so long the world had forgiven it. She found a cabin at the end of a trail that ended in ruins and memory. Old stones half swallowed by moss, a chimney like a broken tooth. The door hung on a single hinge, but it closed without a sound when she pushed it. Inside, the air smelled of dried lavender and wood smoke gone cold. A single shelf held jars full of things you didn't ask for names of. A threadbare quilt lay on a cot. Dust hung in the sunbeams like small planets. Arya put her back to the door and slid down. For the first time in hours, exhaustion pulled out a long, raw breath from her chest. She told herself she would rest, collect herself, and at dawn find a distant town, a boat, a life beneath another moon. Anything but be dragged home to be presented like a prize. She did not know the cabin's name. She did not know who once lived there or what ghosts had left their footprints. She only knew she could hide, tonight at least. At the claiming ground, torches dotted the night like stars caged in iron. Women in pale gowns waited with mouths shut and eyes lowered. Men spoke in chord murmurs, deciding bets and futures on which way the wind would carry the Alpha's favor. Kale moved through that crowd like a dark tide. He was a man whose shadow had learned to command light. Tall, broad, with a presence that made the torches bow. He carried a quiet like a weapon, an evenness most kings pretended to train into themselves, but few achieved, without losing what made them human. He walked to the platform and the murmur softened. He accepted the crown of bones and moonstone without flinching. When the music rose and the names began to be spoken, the list jumped and skipped and, to his eyes, one line lay empty. A name should have been there between Dahlia and Mira, Arya's name. But the parchment tore blank where it should have read. A small thing, and yet Kale felt it like a snag. He tasted ash. This absence tugged at him in a way he could not place. "Where is she?" he asked, and his voice was not the voice of a ruler giving an order. It was the voice of someone who had had something important removed from him without knowing what it was. They told him she had fled into the forest. They said she'd likely hidden in some tangle of roots or fallen in a wolf's path. The words tasted like excuses and relief to the speakers. No one liked to think of the king asking after what had been stolen from his ceremony. Kale listened, then made a decision. The hunt would go out. Not because he had to, but because a thread that reached toward him trembled, and he intended to follow it. Outside the cabin, the wind leaned into the windows and the moon made the broken glass glow, like a promise half kept. Arya moved slowly, more to settle the tremor in her bones than to keep watch. She found a bundle of sticks and coaxed life from them. She read through the healer's journal she'd found on the shelf, pages of recipes for soothed fevers and salves to soothe broken things. One entry struck her. Asterisk, those who hide seldom take the path to who they are meant to be. But hiding teaches you what you will choose. Asterisk. The words made her laugh, but it was a brittle sound. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders and tried to convince herself that choice could be made later. Far away in the shadow of the pines, Cale pushed through the thicket with a small band. His boots dug into frozen earth as he followed a scent only he could hear in the weave of the forest. The air through which he moved had an edge that made his skin prickle. The forest felt alive with presences that were not theirs. He found scraps of ribbon caught on a branch, a blackened smear of footprints that stopped like a question mark. He moved like someone following the invisible architecture of fate and found, at last, a trail that led to old stone and a sagging roof. He paused. The air smelled of lavender and smoke. He smelled the person who had been here, a woman whose scent held cinnamon and the shadow of fear. He closed his eyes. Not all decisions he had made were for war or law. Some were because the moon whispered that something inside him would be whole only with that missing thing. He knocked. It was a soft, measured sound against wood. Not a demand. Not a command. A question. The knock made Arya freeze like a struck deer. Her heart beat in an uneven drum. She had none of the training, none of the tools some possessed to face kings. She had only the shine and thud of terror in her chest. She did not open the door. Cale listened to the breath on the other side of the wood. He heard the small human things, a chair dragged, a step unsteady, the rustle of fabric. He said the name in a low voice. Arya. It was more a promise than a statement. For a moment, the world held its breath. She cracked the door open an inch. A sliver of moonlight fell across his face. He stepped into the doorway, and he took the breath of the cabin as if it belonged to him now. "You're away from the village," he said, voice even. "Why?" "I couldn't stay," Arya said. Her voice came out rough as driftwood. "I won't be paraded like an animal." "You think I parade people?" There was a flicker, perhaps anger, perhaps something else, across his features. "I offer a life." "I don't want a life that begins at parade," she shot back. She stepped back, protecting the small pile of books as if they were shields. Cale's expression softened, and she saw it then. The man beneath the cloak, the wearer of a ruler who had been asked to hold more than any one person should. "What did you think I was?" She met his eyes. His gaze was not the beast's glow she'd feared. It was a grave, slow pool. "I thought you were a story made to frighten girls into marrying." He let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it hurt a little like a ribbed cord. "People tell stories of me to keep others from learning the truth about themselves," he said. "They fear what they don't understand. I'm not a story. I will not make you into one." She swallowed. "Then go." There was a beat where neither moved, and then outside, a distant growl rose and cut the air. Cale's posture shifted, small as a tree bending. He stepped back, hand brushing his own chest where something under skin and bone pulsed, a thing deep and old. "You shouldn't stay here alone," he said. "It's not safe." "You sound like every man who's said something like that before." Her voice was tired. "Take me back to the village. Let me choose in front of everybody, so the shame is shared." A flicker of pain, or maybe confusion, crossed his face. "You think me the sort of man who wants an audience?" He moved as if to leave, then paused. "If you go home to be chosen as spectacle, will you forgive me for having found you?" The question landed in her like a stone. She had thought only of how to run. She had not thought of how she might feel being found. Her answer came not in words, but in the way she folded her fingers into the quilt, like a secret. Wolves slashed the night with silver teeth. They came not like animals but like shadows that remembered how to kill. Arya's breath came sharp. She moved to reach for anything that could be a weapon. Cale did not hesitate. He stepped to the door, and with one fluid motion, he pushed it open and met the first thing that lunged. Where others saw a man, something in the wild recognized a leader. Cale shifted, subtle and terrible, a change that made the air hum. He did not become a wolf. He became something between. He fought like a windstorm shaped into fists, where he struck the ground, and the attackers fell back in confusion. His movements were not cruel, but necessary. When the final rogue slunk away into the trees, he turned and stood beneath the doorway, breathing like a thing that had been wind-struck. Arya watched him with a mixture of horror and awe. Blood dotted his sleeve. He limped with a small, human hitch. "You couldn't stay quiet when they came," she said, voice unsteady. "I didn't want to wake you by my silence." He stepped in and closed the door, and for a heartbeat the cabin felt like a small, beating heart. He sat on the edge of the cot, careful and clumsy at once, like someone moving in a room that had been theirs for the first time. "You could have run," she said. "Why didn't you?" "Because the thing I am doesn't leave parts of me behind." He looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I ran for power for many years. I did not think power would feel like loneliness." Arya found herself leaning forward. "You are lonely?" He let out a breath, sound like a clock that had been wound tight for too long. "You cannot wear a crown without feeling its weight. For all my strength, there are things I am not brave enough to do." He met her eyes with an honesty that cut. "I am brave enough to protect you. That is different." She pressed herbs into his wound because something inside her would not let him remain hurt. Their fingers brushed, and the world outside condensed into a single bright point where skin met skin. He flinched, and from the flinch a new tenderness leaked through. Morning arrived like a slow unwrapping. Light dripped across the cot in gold paper. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath, listening for the footfalls of two people making a choice. They sat by the little stove, sharing a bowl of watered tea. Kale watched Arya with a look that was not the king's and could not be faked. She spoke of small things, the way the market smelled after rain, the name of a baker who gave day-old bread to children, the lullaby her mother had sung in a voice made of thread. He listened as if learning a language no one else used anymore, and loved the sound of it. In the pages of the healer's book, Arya had found a faded map. It showed roads long collapsed, and a marking that had once been the healer's home. She took in those who were claimed and mended them, Arya said. Some left with less fear. "What do you fear?" Kale asked, and it was a question that required no royal audience to be risky. Arya thought of the drums, the hush when her name might be called, the way men traded glances like coins. "I fear becoming something I don't recognize when I look in the glass," she said quietly. "I fear that being chosen will make me a story I don't want to be told." "And what if being chosen makes you a different story?" He reached out and touched the side of her face like someone checking the pulse of a fragile thing. "What if I do not wish to own you, but to know you?" The way he said it made a circle of warmth around the space between them. She felt seen, and she felt small. The two things were not mutually exclusive. That smallness had, in the village, saved her as much as it had damned her. An unremarkable girl could slip away. Now that smallness seemed like a thread that could be rewoven into something else. They argued in gentle ways, testing rules and edges. He told her of the way the pack worked. Hierarchy, like the rings of a tree, promises made in winter and kept through blood. She told him of the women at the claiming, the way they braided hair to hide a scar, the way they practiced smiles like armor. Between them they traded stories and grievances and built, by accident, a quiet intimacy like sewing a seam. When the hours thinned into midday, Kale stood in the doorway. He had a look of a man who must make a decision that would be read aloud to many and judged for the rest of his life. He could take her to the platform, proclaim her in public, put a crown of ritual on her head, and call it fate. Or he could walk away and let her be free to make a life in some nameless port. He turned to her. "I can take you home," he said. "I can make your life safe and full of everything a protector provides. Or I can leave and never come back. Both are my ways of giving you a choice." Arya looked at the framed window where snow had begun to melt in the weak sun. She saw the path she had run, the tree where she had dropped the scrap of ribbon, the place where fear had lived in her. She also saw in Kale something she had never expected, not simply power but a fierce attention, as if he collected the way she blinked and the way she remembered lullabies. She thought of the claiming ground, torches, eyes like knives. She thought of being raised like an offering. She thought of any life given to her as an object. And she thought of the way he had gone to the fighting first, of the way he had let his guard down in the small ways that made him more than his legend. "I do not want to be chosen to make others comfortable," she said finally. "And I do not want a life that begins because someone decided I should be theirs for convenience." "And if I choose you in the open?"
Kale asked.
"If I stand before the whole world and tell them it is you I want, then I will stand with you because I choose the man I stand with," Arya answered. "Not because the drums demand it." He stepped closer. The distance between them was not measurement, but a story folding in. "Say it," he said. "Tell me you choose me." The request was a small table set between two vulnerable things. Arya closed her eyes and breathed like someone plunging into a cold river. Her voice came out a single, determined whisper. "I choose you, Kale. Not because of the crown. Because of you." When those words landed, something inside him broke open and then stitched itself with a new, trembling thread. He took both of her hands in his, careful and fierce at once. "Then we will go together," he said. "Not as spectacle. Not as token. Together." They left the cabin, the quilt pressed under Arya's arm like a relic. The forest watched them go with a respect that had nothing to do with crowns. Kale put his cloak about her shoulders, a shelter shaped as much for warmth as for privacy. For the first time since she had started running, Arya did not look to hide. They reached the edge of the clearing while the village still hummed with rumors. People looked up, some with fear, others with curiosity. Kale held her hand, not as a monarch presenting a prize, but as a man existing with another. There was an electric hush when they came into view. Men lowered their gazes not at obligation but at the unfamiliar sight of a king returning with a woman on his own arm who had chosen him. Whispers hissed through the crowd. "Is she the one?" someone asked. "Did he claim her?" asked another, voice taut with old jealousy. Kale led Arya past the platform, not to lay her on it, but to the small alcove where he did not need to show off his life. There he stopped and turned to the crowd. The moment held the noise of many lives, some content, some bitter, all curious. "I choose her," Kale said simply, and then, because the world expected ritual, he added, "and she chooses me." The words were not a performance. They were an answer to a question no one had been allowed to ask. Arya lifted her chin. She felt like a person stepping into clothes that fit for the first time. People looked at them like two people who had solved a riddle together. Life did not become easy because of a kiss or a proclamation. It took quiet work that no one ever spoke of in stories. They built a life that respected their edges. Kale took his position as Alpha King with the new weight of having someone at his heart who refused to be owned. She learned the rituals not as obligations, but as a part of the land's language she could choose to speak or not. He learned how to listen to small things, arias of wind, and the brush of a hand across a cheek. She learned that his power could be used to carve out sanctuary for others as well. There were nights when old enemies breathed like memories at the windows, and there were days when the small pleasures of bread cooling on a sill carried more joy than songs sung before 1,000 torches. The village changed little at first, then slowly, like thawing ground, it learned to understand that chosen did not mean silent, that power could shelter instead of take. Arya walked marketplaces at dawn beside Kale and watched to see the faces of women who might one day stop practicing smiles. She opened the cabin as a place where people could go who felt themselves unwelcome elsewhere. It became a refuge not of hiding, but of healing. The healer's books were read again with fingers that trembled not from fear, but from hope. Years later, sometimes when the night was thin and the moons were full, Arya would go to the window and look out over the forest that had once been a maze of fear. She would see wolves move like black thoughts along the hillside, and she would feel, not dread, but kinship. She would remember the night she ran and the man who knocked, and how a life could be remade by a single answer. Kale would stand behind her, hands resting on her shoulders. He would step into her small world, not as a conqueror, but as a companion who had learned to love the way she chose to breathe. They had become a story, yes, but one that belonged to them both equally, a story written in acts of mutual choice rather than spectacle. Sometimes fate comes dressed as a knock at midnight. Sometimes fate comes because one refuses to be silenced. The moon watches both and keeps its counsel. What matters is the kind of answer you give when it asks. Aria's answer had been simple. It was true, and it had changed everything.